The night was unnaturally still, as if the world itself held its breath. Captain Tyrek Black Eyes Valen stood at the helm of the Iron Serpent, his dark gaze fixed on the horizon, where the faint outline of Isla del Silencio rose from the mist. For years, he had hunted rumors of this cursed island, believed to hold Blackbeard's greatest treasure. Now the time had come. Blackbeard's gold, silver, and secrets waited beneath those jagged cliffs, if the tales were true. But there was more to the legend than anyone dared to admit. Blackbeard's treasure was said to be cursed, guarded by something far worse than mere men. Tyrek's hand tightened around the wheel, knuckles white. The crew murmured behind him, uneasy, their whispers carried on the salty breeze. They had seen things in these waters, faint lights just beneath the waves, ghostly shapes moving in the mist. His first mate, Zara, stood close by, her brow furrowed as she studied the compass that spun wildly in her hand. "That's no ordinary storm coming," she muttered under her breath, her voice low enough for Tyrek to hear but not the others. "We've come too far to turn back now," Tyrek growled, eyes gleaming with determination. He had nothing left to lose. His past haunted him like a dark shadow, and Blackbeard's treasure was the key to reclaiming his name, his fortune, and more importantly, his power. No cursed legend would stop him. "Ready the longboats." Before Zara could respond, a shout rang from the crow's nest. "Land ahead!" The island loomed closer, its cliffs jagged like the teeth of some waiting beast, rising from the fog with an ominous grandeur. The crew gathered along the rail, staring in awe as the Iron Serpent drifted toward the cursed shore. None of them spoke, but the tension crackled in the air like the threat of lightning. Tyrek turned to Zara, his voice firm. "Get the men ready. We're taking the treasure tonight." "Are you sure about this?" Zara asked, her eyes searching his face for some sign of doubt. But Tyrek's resolve was unshakable. "We'll make our fortune here, or we'll die trying," he said, his voice cold as steel. As the boats hit the sand and the crew stepped onto the shores of Isla del Silencio, a sense of dread washed over them. The wind howled through the palm trees like the wails of lost souls. But Tyrek pressed on, leading his crew toward the ruins they had spotted from the ship. Ancient stone walls half buried in the jungle, crumbling with age. If the map was right, Blackbeard's treasure would be hidden somewhere deep within those ruins. "Stay sharp," Tyrek ordered as they approached the overgrown fortress. "I don't want any surprises." But as they moved deeper into the jungle, the island itself seemed to awaken. Strange flickering lights began to appear in the mist, darting between the trees. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. Tyrek's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he ignored them, driven by the desire to claim what no pirate before him had dared to take. Suddenly, one of the crew let out a strangled cry. Tyrek whirled around, sword drawn, only to see a shadowy figure dart through the fog, disappearing into the trees. The men muttered nervously, clutching their weapons. "Ghosts," they whispered. "The ghosts of Blackbeard's crew." "Keep moving," Tyrek snarled, pushing them forward. But even he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that settled in his gut. They reached the ruins just as the sky darkened further, the moon barely piercing through the thick clouds overhead. Zara was the first to notice the strange symbols carved into the stone walls, ancient, unfamiliar runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. Tyrek didn't care. He had come for one thing, the treasure. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, they found a massive iron door, its surface covered in the same glowing runes. Tyrek approached it with grim determination, ignoring the uneasy glances exchanged by his men. He reached for the door, but Zara grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice low, urgent. "There's something wrong here. This place, it's not right. We should leave before it's too late." Tyrek shook her off, eyes gleaming with a mix of greed and madness. "We've come too far to turn back now," he said again, pushing the door open with a deep, groaning creak. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber, filled with riches beyond imagining. Piles of gold, jewels, and strange artifacts. But in the center of the room stood something far more sinister. An ancient obsidian chest, its surface carved with the same glowing runes, sat in eerie silence. This was the true treasure of Blackbeard, the one that had lured countless pirates to their doom. Tyrek approached the chest, his heart pounding in his chest, and as he opened it, a terrible force seemed to stir. Inside was no gold, no jewels, just a small black shard of stone pulsing with a dark energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "What is it?" one of the men whispered. Backing away in fear, Tyrek reached for the shard, his fingers brushing its surface. And then, everything changed. Before we dive into this dangerous adventure, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. With the shard in his hand, Tyrek's fate is sealed. But what dark forces has he just awakened? And how far will the crew go to escape the curse that has claimed so many before them? Tyrek felt the cold pulse of power as his hand closed around the black shard. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the air seemed to thicken, and a low, ominous hum echoed through the chamber. The walls, adorned with strange symbols, pulsed in sync with the shard. As if the entire island were awakening, Zara's eyes widened, her voice low and strained. "Tyrek, drop it, now!" But Tyrek stood frozen, his mind racing. He had never believed in the superstitions whispered by lesser men, curses, ghosts. They were tales meant to scare away the weak. But this was real. He could feel the power coursing through the relic, a dark and ancient force that promised control over the seas, over life and death itself. He turned to his crew, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "This is it," he said, his voice rough but full of conviction. "Blackbeard's secret. With this, we will command the ocean." Before Zara could protest, the chamber began to tremble. The ground shifted beneath their feet, and the walls groaned as though something enormous was stirring within the very island itself. From the shadows, ghostly shapes began to form, indistinct at first, but then clearer. Faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The crew stepped back in fear, their weapons useless against what was now materializing before them. "Back to the ship," one of the men yelled. But the narrow passage they had entered through was blocked by a sudden rock slide, sealing them inside the ruins. Before we go deeper, what do you think will happen next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The ghostly figures, Blackbeard's cursed crew, began to move toward them, their ethereal forms glowing faintly in the darkness. Tyrek raised the shard instinctively, hoping it would protect them. For a moment, the specters hesitated, their hollow eyes fixated on the relic as though recognizing its power. But then, with a guttural hiss, they surged forward. Zara grabbed Tyrek's arm, dragging him toward the far wall. "This isn't treasure. It's a death sentence." "No," Tyrek muttered, his mind clouded by greed and the promise of power. "It's the key." The crew, panicked and disoriented, began to scatter, their fear driving them deeper into the ruins where the shadows twisted and shifted unnaturally. Screams echoed through the halls as the ghostly forms closed in, tearing through flesh and bone as if the men were no more than paper. The few who managed to fight back quickly learned their weapons were useless. Zara, with a quick glance at Tyrek, knew there was no reasoning with him now. The relic had already claimed him. She cursed under her breath and pulled him toward the only other exit, a narrow staircase descending into the depths of the island. "Tyrek, come on!" she shouted, pulling him down the steps. Behind them, the walls of the ruin crumbled, stones tumbling from the ceiling as the cursed spirits closed in. They descended into a cavern lit by the eerie glow of the relic in Tyrek's hand. The air was thick with moisture, and the faint scent of decay clung to everything. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Zara spotted a passage leading further underground. But something was wrong. The walls were slick with seawater, and the sound of crashing waves echoed ominously. Tyrek stared at the shard, entranced. "This is what Blackbeard used to rule the seas," he murmured, half to himself. "This power is mine." Zara shook her head, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You're a fool. This isn't power, it's a curse. We need to get out of here before—" Her words were cut off by a deafening roar. The ground shook violently and the walls began to crack, seawater pouring through the fissures. The island was sinking, and fast. Above them, the crew that had remained in the ruins was fighting a losing battle. The cursed spirits moved like shadows, unstoppable, relentless. One by one, the men were cut down, their screams carried away by the howling wind. The ruins themselves groaned under the weight of the ocean, crumbling as the island began its descent into the sea. Tyrek, oblivious to the danger, stared at the relic in his hand, his mind consumed by the possibilities it offered. Zara could see the madness growing in his eyes. If she didn't act soon, they would all be dead. She grabbed the shard from his hand, its cold energy surging through her fingers like icy fire. Instantly, the cavern seemed to tremble, and the shadows on the walls writhed as if in pain. The relic was powerful, yes, but it was also unstable. Holding it felt like trying to control the fury of a storm. Tyrek lunged at her, desperation and greed twisting his features. "Give it back," he snarled, his voice almost unrecognizable. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," Zara snapped. "You're going to get us all killed." But before she could throw the shard into the rising waters, a deep guttural voice filled the cavern, echoing off the walls like thunder. The air grew thick with an unnatural presence, and the water at their feet began to swirl, forming a vortex that defied the laws of nature. "Those who seek what is not theirs shall pay the price." Zara's breath caught in her throat. The voice, it was Blackbeard, or what was left of him. Tyrek, oblivious to the warning, lunged again, his eyes wild with obsession. "The power is mine," he screamed, reaching for the shard. But before he could take it, the water surged upward, a massive wave crashing over them, sweeping Tyrek away into the darkness. Zara was thrown back against the cavern wall, the shard slipping from her grasp and falling into the swirling waters below. As she struggled to her feet, gasping for breath, she realized with dawning horror what had just happened. The relic was gone, swallowed by the ocean, and with it any hope of escape. The island continued to sink, the water rising rapidly now, filling the cavern. Zara knew she had only moments before the entire place was underwater. She had to find a way out, and fast. Above her, the last of the crew's screams faded into silence, and the ghostly forms of Blackbeard's cursed men drifted away, their task complete. Zara scrambled toward the only visible exit, a narrow tunnel leading upward, but her path was blocked by a wall of water surging toward her. She barely had time to react before the wave hit, sweeping her off her feet and pulling her deeper into the island's collapsing depths. For a moment, everything was chaos, water, darkness, and the cold grip of death. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the current released her. She broke the surface, gasping for air, only to find herself in a strange, underground lagoon, the ceiling of which shimmered with an eerie, otherworldly light. And in the center of the lagoon, rising from the depths, was something that made her heart stop. A massive, blackened ship, its sails tattered, its hull dripping with the brine of centuries lost beneath the waves. The Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's ship. And it was waiting for her. Zara floated, half-stunned, in the underground lagoon. The towering form of the Queen Anne's Revenge loomed above her like a specter from the depths of time. Its blackened wood creaked ominously, as though the ship had just awoken from a long, cursed slumber. She swam slowly toward it, her limbs heavy with exhaustion but her mind racing with the reality of what lay before her. Blackbeard's legendary flagship, the most feared vessel to ever sail the seas, should have been nothing but rotting bones on the ocean floor. But here it was, waiting for her. The water was deathly cold, the chill biting into her bones as Zara reached the ship's hull. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself onto the ship's rotting ladder, her fingers numb as they clung to the ancient wood. The moment her boots touched the deck, she felt it. The weight of unseen eyes, the oppressive atmosphere thick with a sense of ancient wrath. The air aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge was suffused with a foul mist, and the sails, once majestic, hung in tattered shreds. The deck was silent, too silent, and yet she could hear the faint whispers of the crew long dead, voices that seemed to drift on the wind, accusing, watching. Zara gripped her cutlass tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. "This can't be real," she muttered under her breath, but every step she took was real enough. The ship groaned as though welcoming its new visitor, but the sound was more a warning than an invitation. From behind her, a faint splash echoed through the lagoon, followed by a hoarse, ragged voice that chilled her to the core. Zara! She spun, her cutlass raised, expecting another ghostly figure. But instead, there stood Tyrek. Water streamed off him as he hauled himself aboard, his face twisted in rage, his eyes burning with a madness that had only grown since the relic had slipped from his grasp. "Tyrek, no!" Zara shouted, backing away from him, her eyes darting toward the cabin at the rear of the ship. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Tyrek snarled, his voice barely recognizable. His skin was pallid and his eyes, there was something wrong with them. They glowed faintly with the same eerie light as the cursed crew they had seen in the ruins. Blackbeard's treasure, his true treasure, this ship. It's mine now. The power is mine. Before she could stop him, Tyrek lunged, swinging his cutlass in a wild arc. Zara barely had time to parry the blow, the force of it driving her back across the slick deck. He came at her again, relentless, his eyes blazing with an unnatural fury. It was as if the sea itself had claimed him, twisting him into something beyond human. "Tyrek, stop!" she shouted, ducking another swing. "You're cursed. This ship, it's not salvation, it's a trap." He laughed, a cruel, distorted sound. "You're wrong. This ship was meant to be found. It was meant for me." Before Zara could respond, the mist around them began to thicken. A deep, unnatural groan echoed from below the ship, and the waters around the Queen Anne's Revenge began to churn violently. Something dark and ancient stirred in the depths, something that had been waiting, watching. From the shadows of the mist, the cursed crew began to appear. Ghostly figures materialized on the deck, their hollow eyes glowing with a terrible light. They moved with the slow, deliberate purpose of the damned, their spectral hands gripping rusted weapons, their faces twisted with rage. Blackbeard's crew had returned to protect their captain's legacy, and no living soul would leave the ship alive. Zara's pulse quickened. They were surrounded. "Tyrek, listen to me," she shouted, desperation creeping into her voice. "We have to get off this ship." But Tyrek was beyond reason. His mind was lost to the curse, his lust for power too great. He charged at her again, and this time Zara knew she couldn't hold back. With a cry of anguish, she deflected his blade and slashed low, catching him in the leg. He stumbled, but the madness in his eyes didn't dim.
Hey there! Quick message. Grab a paper, write down. You pirate. Our channel name. Come back soon. We've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
He swung wildly, and Zara barely avoided the blow. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently to one side, and both of them were thrown to the deck. The sea around them roared as if the very ocean was coming alive. The cursed crew moved closer, their glowing eyes fixed on Tyrek and Zara. The sound of their raspy breaths filled the air as they advanced, silent but deadly. Zara scrambled to her feet, but Tyrek was already charging again, driven by something more than just anger. "I will claim Blackbeard's power," he screamed, his voice ragged. The ship groaned again, the mist thickening until it was almost suffocating. From the cabin at the rear of the ship, Zara could hear something. Something deep, dark, and malevolent. The very essence of the curse, the captain's quarters, the source of it all. Zara made her choice. With one final parry, she disarmed Tyrek, sending his cutlass skittering across the deck. But instead of finishing him off, she turned and sprinted toward the captain's cabin. She could feel the curse tightening around them both. The ship was sinking, and with it, their chance for escape. Behind her, Tyrek's scream of rage echoed through the mist. "You can't leave me here!" But Zara didn't look back. She burst into the cabin, the heavy door slamming behind her. The air inside was thick, almost choking, and the room was bathed in a sickly green glow. At the far end of the cabin, sitting on a raised dais, was the source of it all. The blackened remains of Blackbeard's throne, carved from bones and seaweed, drenched in centuries of dark magic. At its base lay a chest, larger and far more ominous than the one they'd found in the ruins. This was the true treasure. As she approached, the air grew colder, and the whispering voices of the cursed crew grew louder, urging her forward. With trembling hands, Zara opened the chest. Inside, she didn't find gold or jewels, but a heart, blackened, shriveled, and pulsating faintly with dark energy. The heart of Blackbeard himself, kept alive by the curse, beating slowly in rhythm with the waves. This was the key to the entire nightmare. Destroying it would end the curse, but it would also doom her to the same fate as Tyrek. If she took the heart, she might not survive. Outside, the ship groaned again, and the sound of Tyrek's mad laughter echoed through the walls. Zara knew she didn't have much time. She looked down at the cursed heart, its slow pulse mirroring the faint hope she still held on to. There was only one way out. She raised her cutlass and brought it down. The heart shattered with a sickening crack, and in that moment the entire ship seemed to scream. The walls shook violently, the deck buckled beneath her feet, and a blinding light filled the room. The curse was breaking, but so was the ship. The moment Zara's cutlass split Blackbeard's heart in two, the air itself seemed to tear apart with a deafening scream. A blinding white-hot light exploded from the cursed relic, engulfing the entire ship. Zara was thrown back, slamming against the cabin wall as the ship groaned like a dying beast beneath her. The cursed heart, the ancient chest, and the throne, all of it dissolved into the ether, consumed by the curse's unraveling. The Queen Anne's revenge shuddered violently, and outside the sea erupted in chaos. Waves crashed against the hull, swirling in a furious maelstrom as if the ocean itself was dragging the ship into its depths. The cursed crew let out one final guttural wail, their ghostly forms dissolving into mist. Finally freed from the curse that had bound them for centuries, Zara's chest heaved as she struggled to rise, her vision blurred from the intensity of the light. She knew she had only moments to escape before the ship, along with everything and everyone on it, was claimed by the sea. She burst out of the cabin, stumbling onto the deck, which now tilted precariously as the Queen Anne's revenge began to sink. The sky was a swirl of dark clouds and lightning, and the waters churned like a cauldron around the doomed vessel. Tyrek was still there, his face twisted in rage and desperation as the ship descended. He staggered toward her, his eyes wild with madness. "You did this!" he screamed, his voice hoarse as he fought against the pitch of the deck. "The power was ours. You've destroyed it all." Zara gripped her cutlass tighter, backing away toward the edge of the ship. "It was never ours, Tyrek. It was a curse. You've doomed yourself to this madness." "No!" he bellowed, stumbling forward as the ship tilted further. "It was supposed to be mine." The waters surged up, licking the sides of the ship, and for a moment Tyrek seemed to falter, his eyes flickering with something, fear, realization, but it was too late. The deck beneath him gave way with a sickening crack, and Tyrek, the once feared captain, plummeted into the depths with a final enraged scream, swallowed by the sea and the curse that had claimed him. Zara barely had time to register his fall before the ship groaned again, the timbers splintering as the ocean consumed it. The Queen Anne's revenge was sinking, fast. With no time to waste, Zara leapt from the deck, diving into the churning waters below. The cold shock of the sea hit her like a punch to the chest, and she fought to keep her head above the waves as the ship disappeared beneath the surface. The maelstrom swirled around her, the pull of the sinking wreck dragging her down. She kicked furiously, fighting against the current, her lungs burning as the force of the water tried to pull her into the abyss. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm began to calm. The waves slowed, the wind died, and the sea turned eerily still. Zara's head broke the surface, gasping for air, as the swirling waters beneath her stilled into an unnatural calm. She turned in the water, her eyes scanning the horizon. The Iron Serpent, her ship, bobbed not far off, still anchored in the lagoon. Somehow, against all odds, she had survived. But as she swam toward it, a heavy weight settled in her chest. Tyrek was gone, his greed and obsession having sealed his fate. And though she had broken the curse, it had come at a terrible cost. Zara hauled herself aboard the Iron Serpent, her muscles aching and her breath ragged. The crew, what little was left of them, stared in stunned silence as she collapsed onto the deck, soaking wet and trembling from the cold. Zara lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, the storm clouds breaking to reveal the pale light of dawn. The silence was broken by a familiar voice. "Captain, is it over?" Zara turned to see her first mate, Davir, standing at the edge of the deck, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes filled with cautious hope. He had managed to survive the ordeal, but the haunted look in his eyes told her that the horrors they had witnessed would never truly leave them. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body protesting. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse. "The ship's gone. The relic's destroyed, Blackbeard's curse, it's finished." Devere nodded, his gaze drifting to the spot where the Queen Anne's revenge had disappeared beneath the waves. "And Tyrek?" Zara looked down, her heart heavy. "He didn't make it." The crew exchanged grim looks, but no one spoke. They had all seen what Tyrek had become, what the curse had done to him. In the end, he had been consumed by the very power he sought to control. Zara stood, her legs shaky but steady enough to carry her to the helm. She looked out over the calm waters, her mind racing with the events of the last few hours. The treasure had been real, but it was no prize worth dying for. Blackbeard's legacy was one of death, madness, and ruin, and anyone who sought his treasure would meet the same fate. But there was something else, something more dangerous still. As Zara gripped the wheel, preparing to guide the Iron Serpent away from the cursed island, her thoughts lingered on the Queen Anne's revenge. The ship had sunk, but the darkness that had surrounded it, the curse itself, still lingered in the depths. She could feel it, like a faint pulse beneath the water, waiting for the next fool to come searching for Blackbeard's treasure. Zara knew that this was not the end. The sea held many secrets, and there were always those greedy enough to chase them. "Set a course for Tortuga," she called to her crew, her voice steady once more. "We need to regroup, and I've got a feeling this won't be our last run-in with Blackbeard's legacy." Devere nodded, and the crew moved to their stations, relieved to have a new destination in mind, far from the cursed shores of Isla del Silencio. As the ship sailed into the rising sun, Zara allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She had survived, but she knew better than anyone that the sea was never truly at rest. Beneath its surface, the currents of power and darkness still churned, waiting for the next unwary soul to fall into its grasp. Zara had seen the cost of that power, and she would never forget it. But she also knew that the sea, just like fate, was a cruel mistress, and its dangers were far from over. If you've enjoyed this thrilling pirate adventure, make sure to subscribe for more high seas tales. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow adventurers and click the link for the next video. There are always more treasures to be found and more curses to break.